Sergeant Major Lena Harper had never been the type to stand out, not in the way others might expect. As a woman of color with a distinguished career in the military, she'd learned the value of blending in, maintaining composure no matter the situation. She was accustomed to holding herself with dignity, whether in a high-stakes meeting with military leaders or in the quiet moments of a long drive home. On this particular afternoon, though, Lena was driving through a small town on her way to a conference, and as she passed a quiet stretch of road, a police siren flared behind her. She glanced at her rearview mirror. A white patrol car was tailing her, lights flashing in the late afternoon sun. There was no immediate reason for concern. She hadn't been speeding, and she had kept to the speed limit. Still, she slowed down, guiding her car to the side of the road and pulling into a small parking lot near an old red brick diner. The officer stepped out of his car with a firm stride, his uniform crisp, but his demeanor tense. Officer Douglas was a man in his late 30s, his broad shoulders giving off an air of authority as he walked toward her car. His expression was neutral, perhaps even a bit bored, as though he'd seen dozens of traffic stops that day. When he reached her window, he knocked gently before bending down, his eyes scanning through the roll-down glass. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Officer Douglas said, his tone polite but brisk. "Do you know why I pulled you over today?" Lena, who had always valued respect and courtesy, met his gaze without flinching. "No, officer, I'm not sure," she replied, her voice steady. She hadn't seen any reason for the stop. She'd been following the road signs, driving as cautiously as always. The officer glanced down at his ticket pad, then back up at her. "I noticed you veered a bit too close to the curb back there. It's a minor infraction, but I'll need to write you up for it." Lena nodded, absorbing the information with the same calm demeanor she had learned to perfect over years of military service. "I see," she said softly, offering no resistance. After all, it was just a ticket, and she had no reason to escalate things. She took a deep breath, choosing not to challenge the officer's judgment. Perhaps he was simply doing his job. As he walked back to his squad car to complete the paperwork, Lena glanced at the sun sinking lower in the sky. The peaceful quiet of the small town felt oddly out of place now, as if something was about to shift. She pulled out her phone, flicking through a few emails, all while keeping her eyes trained on the officer's movements. Moments later, Officer Douglas returned with the ticket in hand, his steps slower this time. "I'm issuing a citation," he said, his tone slightly more serious than before. "Please sign here, Mom." Lena took the ticket, signed without complaint, and handed it back. She thanked the officer politely as he left her car, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Weeks passed, and Lena had almost forgotten about the minor traffic ticket. She had a full schedule of meetings, legal briefs to review, and countless decisions to make for the military's legal division. But then, one morning, an envelope arrived at her doorstep. She recognized the official font immediately. Summons for court appearance. At first, she thought it might be a mistake. After all, she had signed the ticket without dispute, and her record was impeccable. But as she read through the details, she saw the time and date listed for a hearing in the small town where she had been stopped. It was a typical routine matter, just a traffic violation that she could have easily settled with a fine or payment. But there was something about the way the court documents were worded that intrigued her. Something about the process felt off. For a brief moment, Lena thought about letting it go, perhaps using her military influence to have the case dismissed quietly. But something stopped her. She had always believed in the importance of fairness, and she didn't want to use her position to bypass a legitimate system of law, no matter how small the issue. And so, with resolve, she made a decision. She would appear in court, as any citizen would. The day of the hearing arrived, and Lena walked into the courthouse with the same poise she carried everywhere. She wore a simple yet professional outfit, nothing that might draw too much attention. She didn't want to make a spectacle of the situation. As she entered the courtroom, she was greeted with a mixture of curious stares. Most of the townspeople had never seen anyone like her, especially not in a small, relatively quiet courtroom. The judge, Judge Samuel Clark, was already seated at the bench, flipping through a stack of paperwork. He looked up briefly, sizing her up, but didn't appear particularly interested in who she was. To him, she was just another defendant in his courtroom. He looked over at his clerk, then back at Lena, gesturing for her to take a seat. Lena's calm presence seemed to unsettle some of the onlookers who whispered among themselves. They didn't know who she was, but her confident posture and composed demeanor stood out against the usual crowd of traffic offenders. Judge Clark, a man in his early 50s, had been presiding over the court for years, and he was no stranger to giving stern judgments. He was known for being somewhat heavy-handed when it came to fines, believing that it was his duty to enforce the law strictly and without compromise. As Lena sat in the courtroom, she couldn't help but wonder how this would play out. It was clear he hadn't yet noticed who she was, nor did he seem to care much about anything other than issuing a fine. Lena took a seat quietly, bracing herself for what would surely be a straightforward affair. Just another day in court. But as the session began, she could already sense that something might not go as expected. The court was quiet except for the rustling of papers and the faint sound of a clock ticking. Lena sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady ahead. Judge Clark was already moving forward with the cases before hers, handling them with his usual brisk efficiency. There were no pleasantries, no small talk. It was clear he was just here to get through his caseload as quickly as possible. As the previous defendant left the stand, Lena's name was called. The judge barely glanced up from his papers as he motioned for her to approach. Sergeant Major Lena Harper, Judge Clark read aloud, his voice indifferent. "You're here for a minor traffic violation, correct?" Lena stood, offering a nod and a respectful acknowledgement. "Yes, Your Honor," she said evenly, her voice clear and controlled. Judge Clark gave her a cursory glance, taking in her professional attire. Smart, simple, yet sharply tailored. He made a quick mental note of the military rank indicated on the summons, but it didn't seem to register. To him, she was just another person in his courtroom, regardless of her background. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and then looked at the ticket in front of him. "You were cited for failing to maintain your lane and veering a bit too close to the curb. Do you admit to this, or would you like to contest it?" Lena met his eyes, her expression neutral. She hadn't intended to challenge the citation, but she couldn't help noticing the way the judge's words seemed to carry a certain weight. He wasn't asking her for an explanation. He wasn't interested in hearing her side. He was simply moving forward with his assessment, as though he had already made up his mind. "I acknowledge the citation, Your Honor," Lena said calmly. "I don't contest the charge." The judge nodded, flipping through a few more papers, his eyes scanning for the next piece of information. He didn't seem to be fully engaged, almost as if the hearing was just a box to check off in his busy day. "The fine is $150 for the violation," Judge Clark declared, his tone clipped. He didn't bother looking up from his desk as he continued. "And I'll also be adding a point to your driving record. That's the standard procedure. Please make sure you pay the fine within 30 days. Lena remained composed. She had expected this, though it still felt a bit dismissive. Her reputation as a legal expert had no weight here. To the judge, she was just another driver who had made a small mistake. There was no acknowledgement of her position, no recognition of the years of service she had dedicated to the country, to military law. As the judge handed down the ruling, he barely made eye contact. His indifference felt like a quiet insult. She was just one of the hundreds of cases he would rule on today, no more important than the next defendant who would step up after her. But Lena knew this wasn't just a momentary slight. There was something bigger at play here. She was being treated like any other person in that room, but she wasn't. And she wasn't sure yet if she would allow this dismissal to go unnoticed. The moment the judge pronounced the fine, the tension in the courtroom subtly shifted. While most of the defendants who passed through Judge Clark's court had either resigned themselves to the penalties or quietly accepted their fate. There was something about Lena's presence that made the ruling feel heavier, somehow more final. Yet she showed no outward sign of agitation. She accepted the judgment with a calm that matched her military demeanor. "Thank you, Your Honor," Lena said quietly as she stood, her hands still folded in front of her. She didn't make a scene, didn't challenge his authority. She merely nodded, acknowledging the court's decision. But as Lena turned to walk back to her seat, she noticed a few heads turning in her direction. A hushed whisper passed through the room. People were beginning to notice something unusual, but no one could put their finger on it. Was it her military posture? The subtle air of authority that surrounded her? Or perhaps it was just the fact that she hadn't reacted like the others had when faced with a fine, but instead remained composed and almost detached. Judge Clark, meanwhile, shuffled a few more papers around on his desk, clearly eager to move on. He didn't linger on the case. He was already looking ahead to the next one, his mind seemingly elsewhere. Lena, however, was acutely aware of the quiet judgment in the room. It wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated in civilian spaces, but this situation felt different. There was something about the way Judge Clark had handled the entire encounter that didn't sit well with her. His complete lack of recognition for her standing, his offhanded dismissal, even his tone, had struck a nerve. It wasn't just the fine. It was the entire atmosphere of the court that rubbed her the wrong way. She returned to her seat, placing the ticket in her bag, her thoughts racing. While the fine was relatively small in the grand scheme of things, it was the principle behind it that bothered her. She was used to respect being given where it was due, whether in a military briefing or a high-level legal meeting. Here, in this small-town courthouse, her position seemed irrelevant. Her rank, her accomplishments, her role as the military's top legal officer, none of it had made a difference. To Judge Clark, she was just another person to fine and forget. The more she thought about it, the more the unfairness of the situation started to gnaw at her. She had known the rules when she entered the court, but now she felt something shifting within her, a decision forming in the back of her mind. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay composed, but there was no reason to let this slide. She would not walk away without making a statement. As the judge called for the next case, Lena straightened in her chair. She wasn't finished yet. She was going to make sure Judge Clark understood who she was, and why that mattered. The courtroom was about to change, whether the judge realized it or not. As the next defendant was called to the stand, Lena's thoughts swirled. The fine, the courtroom's casual dismissal of her, none of it sat right with her, but she wasn't ready to speak out just yet. She had been taught to fight battles on her terms, and this was no different. She glanced around the room, noting the subtle curiosity of the onlookers, the mix of unease and mild intrigue, as her calm demeanor had set her apart. It wasn't until the next case had concluded, and the room grew still again, that Lena knew what she had to do. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, her expression as serene as ever. All eyes turned toward her. But this time, she was no longer going to remain silent. "Your Honor," Lena's voice rang out, strong and clear, cutting through the murmur of the courtroom. Judge Clark, who had just finished addressing the next case, looked up at her, his brow furrowing in slight confusion. "Yes, Sergeant Major Harper," he asked, his tone now tinged with a hint of irritation, though he had no idea what was about to happen. Lena walked to the center of the courtroom with quiet confidence, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. When she reached the front, she paused, standing tall, fully aware of the weight of the room's attention. "I believe you should know who I am before we proceed any further," she said, her tone measured but firm. She pulled a small envelope from her bag, its official seal glinting under the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. She didn't need to say much more. Lena handed the envelope to the bailiff, who took it to Judge Clark without a word. The judge took the envelope and tore it open without hesitation, but as he read the contents inside, his face visibly changed. His eyes widened slightly, his lips pressed together as though the reality of what he was reading had stunned him. He quickly glanced up at Lena, his face losing some of its earlier composure. The courtroom fell completely silent, all eyes on the judge as he looked from the letter back to Lena, clearly startled. He cleared his throat, an awkward pause filling the air. He adjusted his glasses, though his hands were slightly unsteady now. "Sergeant Major Harper, I wasn't aware," he stammered, clearly caught off guard by the revelation. The letter, of course, had detailed Lena's position as the chief legal officer for the United States military, someone who was entrusted with overseeing legal matters for the entire armed forces, a powerful and respected role. Lena stood still, her posture as composed as ever, letting the silence hang in the air for a beat. She didn't interrupt his fumbling apology or his search for words. She simply waited, allowing the full weight of her title and her presence to settle in. "I'm not here to make a scene, Your Honor," she said calmly, "but I do believe that proper respect and fairness should be extended to all individuals, regardless of their background. My rank and my career may not matter to you, but they matter to the country I serve, and they matter to the legal system that we are both a part of." The judge's face shifted from discomfort to a kind of recognition, though it was more self-aware than respectful at that moment. He looked down at the papers in front of him, his earlier confidence now gone. For the first time in this entire proceeding, Judge Clark seemed uncertain, perhaps even a little regretful. Lena's voice was calm, yet her words carried an undeniable weight. "I understand the need for process, but there are lines between procedure and disrespect, Your Honor. I trust you'll be able to reflect on that." As the courtroom held its breath, Judge Clark's discomfort deepened. He opened his mouth to speak but stopped himself, clearly uncertain of how to proceed now that the full extent of who Lena was had come to light. The moment hung in the air, heavy with the weight of Lena's words. Judge Clark stood motionless for a few seconds, still processing the fact that he had just found one of the most powerful legal minds in the country. The silence was almost unbearable, and the tension was palpable. He glanced down at the papers before him, his eyes quickly darting back to Lena, then to the courtroom full of eyes that were now fixated on him. His initial impulse was to deflect, to assert his authority and move on with the case. But something stopped him. The realization of his error settled in slowly, a creeping discomfort that made his cheeks flush with heat. The stark contrast between Lena's unshakable composure and his own sudden unease was a stark reminder of how little he had truly understood about her. I apologize," Judge Clark finally stammered, his voice less certain than it had been just moments earlier. "I had no idea." His words, though respectful, sounded almost inadequate in the face of what had just unfolded. His gaze faltered as he made an effort to regain his composure, but it was clear the situation had rattled him. Lena's expression softened, but there was no sign of triumph on her face. She hadn't sought to make him feel small or expose his ignorance, but her calmness in the face of his harsh judgment had revealed something far deeper, a disregard for respect that could not be overlooked. "I understand, Your Honor," Lena replied, her voice cool and steady. "But respect is not something earned through recognition of rank. It's something expected in every courtroom, regardless of the defendant's position." Judge Clark nodded, visibly shaken by the depth of the situation. He could feel the weight of his earlier treatment, his automatic assumption that Lena was just another faceless driver in his court. His professional pride, and perhaps even his own unexamined biases, had clouded his judgment. "I've made a mistake," he admitted, meeting her gaze now with a more genuine sense of regret. "And I will correct it. I will reconsider the fine. Sergeant Major Harper, I'll ensure that this is handled more appropriately." Lena didn't respond immediately, allowing the judge to reflect in silence. She could see the discomfort in his face, but she wasn't interested in extracting a dramatic apology. What mattered to her was that he had recognized his error, and more importantly, was willing to acknowledge it publicly. That was the beginning of change, no matter how small. The room, once tense with a kind of uneasy tension, now seemed to shift. Whispers filled the air as onlookers exchanged glances, aware of the shift in power dynamics and the quiet lesson unfolding before them. Lena had not sought to humiliate anyone, but her measured presence had forced the issue into the light. It wasn't about revenge or correction. It was about fairness, respect, and the very foundation of justice itself. Judge Clark stood taller now, though his words faltered slightly. "I will issue a refund for the fine, and I'll take a closer look at your case. I believe this matter can be dismissed in its entirety." Lena simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. That is all I ask." The tension in the room began to dissipate, the storm of the moment passing as quickly as it had arrived. But for Judge Clark, the lessons of the day had only just begun. News of the courtroom encounter spread quickly. Within hours, the story of Sergeant Major Lena Harper, the high-ranking military legal officer, becoming the subject of a routine traffic violation case, only to reveal her true identity to an unsuspecting judge, was all over social media and local news outlets. The incident was captured by a few onlookers, and soon, the clip of Lena's calm but firm confrontation with Judge Clark went viral. Headlines flashed across screens. "White judge finds black woman only to learn she's the military's top legal officer." As the story gained traction, Lena found herself in the midst of an unexpected media storm. She didn't seek out the spotlight. She had acted simply out of principle. But now, her poise in the face of dismissal was being celebrated as a powerful example of grace under pressure. News outlets praised her calm dignity, with commentators drawing attention to how she maintained control of the situation without raising her voice or demanding special treatment. Across the country, people watched the video with varying reactions. Some were impressed by her professionalism and composure, while others were critical of Judge Clark's initial treatment of her. It was clear that his handling of the case had struck a nerve, especially within the context of ongoing conversations about race, authority, and institutional biases. The fact that a judge had so easily dismissed someone of Lena's stature, a woman, a person of color, a decorated officer in the military, felt like a glaring example of something deeper at play. Meanwhile, Judge Clark faced mounting pressure. Local news outlets began digging into his professional history, finding instances where he had been known for his strict rulings, often without much room for leniency. It quickly became apparent that his heavy-handed approach to minor infractions, particularly his lack of consideration for Lena's status, had not been an isolated incident. His behavior was scrutinized by the public, and many questioned whether his actions had been influenced by unconscious bias. The courthouse, too, became the subject of public discourse. Protesters gathered outside, holding signs that read, "Justice is for all," and "Respect in the courtroom." Activists spoke out, calling for reforms to ensure that judges and law enforcement officers took greater care in recognizing the backgrounds of the people they interacted with, regardless of race or rank. As for Lena, she remained composed amidst the media frenzy. She gave a few brief interviews, in which she emphasized the need for fairness, but she made it clear that her purpose in speaking out wasn't to attack Judge Clark personally. Instead, she wanted to highlight the larger issue, that every person, regardless of their identity, deserved to be treated with respect in the eyes of the law. She also acknowledged that her position in the military gave her a unique platform, but that shouldn't mean others should be overlooked or dismissed for their lack of status. The incident led to a significant conversation about biases within the justice system, both civilian and military. Lena's experience served as a mirror for others to reflect on their own treatment within the courts and prompted discussions about how these biases can subtly shape the outcomes of even the most routine interactions. As the days went by, the story gained more national attention. Judge Clark issued a public apology, acknowledging his mistake. He promised to undergo sensitivity training and seek guidance on handling cases with more awareness of the people before him. Though his apology was seen as a step in the right direction, many wondered whether it would be enough to undo the damage done by his initial actions. In the end, Lena didn't seek the apology. She had made her point. Her steady presence had turned what could have been a routine day into a powerful moment of reflection for the justice system. Her actions reverberated far beyond the courtroom, prompting a larger conversation about the integrity of the legal process and the need for fairness in all its forms. In the weeks following the courtroom incident, the conversation surrounding Judge Clark's mistake and Lena Harper's dignified response continued to capture public attention. News outlets continued to revisit the story, offering deeper analyses of its implications. Legal experts, civil rights advocates, and even military officials weighed in, each drawing their own conclusions from the event. For Lena, however, the public spotlight was never her intention. She had been caught in a situation that had forced her to speak up, not just for herself, but for anyone who had been unfairly treated or overlooked due to assumptions about their identity. It wasn't about shaming Judge Clark, but rather about fostering a deeper understanding of how institutional biases could unknowingly shape the experiences of everyday citizens. As the media storm died down, Lena reflected on the ripple effects of what had transpired. In her quiet moments, she thought about the countless others who had sat in courtrooms and faced the same sort of treatment, but without the luxury of speaking out, of having a platform to make their voices heard. She knew that, for some, her actions had provided a much-needed sense of validation, proof that even in an environment as rigid as a courtroom, integrity and fairness could still prevail. Judge Clark, on the other hand, found himself in the midst of a profound transformation. The public backlash was not easily forgotten, but it forced him to take a hard look at his own biases, his automatic assumptions about people based on their appearance or background. He had been a judge for years, with decades of experience, but the incident with Lena opened his eyes to the subtle prejudices that he had allowed to shape his decisions without even realizing it. Under intense scrutiny, Judge Clark took steps to address his shortcomings. He began attending sensitivity training sessions, and he also reached out to a diverse group of legal professionals, including Lena, to seek counsel on how to better navigate the complexities of race, class, and privilege in the courtroom. He even publicly acknowledged that his behavior in Lena's case had been an example of the kind of bias that could plague the legal system. When he issued his apology, it was clear that his words were genuine. He admitted that his treatment of Lena had been a failure on his part, not just as a judge, but as a person. He expressed regret for not recognizing her professional standing earlier, but also for failing to extend basic courtesy and fairness to someone who deserved it. His apology was met with mixed reactions, but many agreed that it was a step toward accountability. For Lena, the most meaningful outcome was the ripple effect her actions had on the justice system. She had not set out to be a public figure, but by confronting the issue head-on, she had sparked a conversation that was long overdue. Judges, attorneys, and officers across the country took a hard look at their own biases, and some even began to advocate for reforms to ensure that individuals from all walks of life were treated with fairness and respect in the legal system. Months later, Lena received a letter from Judge Clark. It wasn't an apology. He had already issued one, but rather a note of thanks. He wrote that her actions had made him a better judge, and more importantly, a better person. The letter was simple, sincere, and signed, "With respect, Judge Samuel Clark." Lena kept the letter, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that real change often starts with difficult conversations, and that the courage to speak up, no matter the stakes, could have an impact far beyond one courtroom.